The House has introduced a bill which would ban student visas for all Chinese nationals. Meanwhile, a congressional committee has demanded that several universities hand over information on all their Chinese students. Is this the start of a new Red Scare on college campuses? We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a new show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace, where every week we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm your host, Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. China is reversing paralysis. In a clinical trial led by Shanghai's Fudan University, 4 paralyzed patients regained control of their legs within 24 hours of a minimally invasive surgery. The 4 could suddenly lift limbs that had been paralyzed, could walk independently within just a matter of weeks, and they even experienced restored nerve function. The Chinese team implanted electrode chips in the brain and spinal cord to create a bridge or neural bypass, thus reconnecting the body's own pathways. This is a major medical breakthrough, as paralysis caused by spinal cord injuries has long been considered irreversible. The Chinese government last week delivered its first batch of donations for the construction of photovoltaic solar parks in Cuba, adding 120 megawatts to the national electric system. This is part of a joint project aimed at boosting Cuba's deteriorating national electric system, which has experienced 4 massive blackouts in just 6 months. These first components were delivered to 6 provinces most prone to blackouts and fuel shortages. Huaxin, the Chinese ambassador to Cuba, stated that these new solar parks could also significantly reduce the consumption of fossil fuels. The biggest obstacle to Cuba obtaining sufficient fuel to maintain its electrical grid is the web of sanctions and coercive measures imposed on the island by the United States. This has led to an unprecedented energy crisis in the last few years. China's Hunan province is leveraging AI to revolutionize its agricultural sector. By integrating smart technologies like drones, sensors, and AI-driven data analysis, farmers can now monitor crop health, optimize irrigation, and predict yields more efficiently. These advancements help minimize resource waste and increase productivity, positioning Hunan as a leader in modern sustainable farming practices. Challenges such as high initial costs and the need for digital literacy among farmers remain, but the long-term benefits, including food security and climate resilience, makes AI adoption a priority. Hunan's progress serves as a model for other regions aiming to merge agriculture with cutting-edge technology. A breakthrough brain-machine interface developed in China has given an aphasic ALS patient the ability to speak again. The new Cyber Matrix BMI system, a semi-invasive wireless implant with 128 high-density electrodes, was successfully placed in the patient's speech control brain region by Beijing's Xianwu Hospital. Just days after surgery, the device achieved 52% accuracy in decoding thought-to-speech signals, with hopes that further training will allow complex expression like poetry. China is rapidly advancing BMI innovation, and the same technology has also helped paralyzed patients control robotic limbs. The progress highlights China's ambition to lead in neurotechnology, offering new hope for patients with neurological disorders. Well, recent developments in Washington seem to signal the beginning of a new Red Scare on college campuses, with Congress targeting Chinese students claiming that they pose a threat to national security. To discuss these developments, we are pleased to have on Mark Tseng-Putterman. Mark is a writer and historian based in New York City. His research focuses on the influence of U.S. empire on Asian American community politics during the Cold War, and his writing on anti-Asian violence, U.S. China relations, and Asian American activism has appeared in outlets including Monthly Review, Roar Magazine, and Time. Mark, welcome to the China Report.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Good to see you. Well, just to jump right into it, there are 2 really alarming developments that happened within Washington within the past few weeks that I wanted to talk about. The first is that the House introduced a new bill called the Stop CCP Visas Act, that is Stop Chinese Communist Prying by Vindicating Intellectual Safeguards in Academia Act. And this bill basically bars any Chinese national from obtaining any kind of student visa in the United States. And this bill is a little bit different from previous legislation in that it goes further than these past laws, in that it prohibits any student of Chinese descent from obtaining a student visa, whereas previous legislation targeted Chinese grad students within the STEM fields. And a lot of critics have also charged that this bill is reminiscent of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So pretty soon after the House introduced that bill, on March 19th, separately, the Select Committee on the CCP, which is a congressional committee, they sent letters to several university presidents in the U.S. basically demanding information on all of their Chinese national students, including all universities that they had previously attended, what type of research they've conducted, sources of funding, a list of laboratories and research initiatives that they currently work in, among other things. And these universities that were sent letters include 6 universities, Carnegie Mellon, Purdue University, Stanford, the University of Illinois, the University of Maryland, and the University of Southern California. And of course, these are all universities with like high populations of Chinese students that work in STEM. So for its part, Beijing has responded by demanding protections for all these students from the universities. So I guess when I read about that, it sent alarm bells off in my head because it reminded me of 2 things. It reminded me of during the first Trump administration when they canceled all of the canceled student visas for thousands of Chinese students. That was an executive order that he signed. And it also reminded me of the China Initiative, which was this initiative during the Trump administration that was basically a program of racial profiling of Chinese researchers. So I guess to start, I want to get your take on these really alarming developments. Like, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, so clearly this legislation is very extreme and very much an expansion of like a longstanding targeting, specifically, as you mentioned, of Chinese students in STEM, Chinese scientists and researchers. And I think, it's important to note that a lot of this actually precedes the Trump administration. It precedes the China Initiative, this kind of racial profiling of Chinese students and researchers. Really can be traced back to a high-profile case in 1999 when a Taiwan-born scientist named Wen-Ho Lee, who was a naturalized citizen, a nuclear scientist employed by the Department of Education, is swept up basically in these nuclear espionage charges that he has been transferring state secrets to the People's Republic of China. And Wen-Ho Lee is basically put under house arrest. He's denied bail and held under, I believe, solitary confinement, actually, for almost a year while the federal government tries to put together its case. And ultimately, I believe he's convicted of only 1 of 49 original convictions. That is relatively benign, something about mishandling of private information. And so this is a really kind of early case in 1999. This is under the Clinton administration. It's even before, the timeline we kind of traditionally associate with this new Cold War escalation with China. And even back then, we're seeing this very specific targeting of Chinese scientists. And so, the other thing I'll note besides that kind of longer precedent of targeting Chinese scientists and students is, this broader context of the way that xenophobia is really animating a lot of the Trump administration's policies and rhetoric in really concerning ways. So I'm thinking, for instance, of recent news that the Trump administration is going to throw its weight behind federal legislation to ban all Chinese nationals from buying U.S. real estate, which is based on state models that have been passed in places like Florida. Of course, Trump's anti-immigrant, pro-deportation rhetoric in the campaign trail actually specifically named Chinese immigrants. In his words, he was very focused on Chinese military-age men, who he argued were forming basically a proxy army for the Communist Party in the United States. So, I think this particular bill is part of a much broader program of xenophobia that is not only limited to the geopolitical terrain, but is very much impacting Chinese in the United States.
Yeah, I want to say one thing it's that when Trump was, putting all of the Venezuelan migrants on the plane to El Salvador, just a couple of weeks ago, he invoked the Alien Enemies Act to do that, which is like this old 18th century law that's like only invoked during wartime. And the last time that he invoked that was during World War II, and that was to justify putting Japanese Americans in concentration camps, in internment camps in the US. So I definitely agree with you that this seems to be setting the stage for a larger program of mass deportations of, like all immigrants, including Chinese nationals. But I wanted to go back to this bill and this select committee on the CCP statement. And I want to read some statements that have been put out surrounding both, because I think the language around it is very alarming and it's very concerning. So the Stop CCP Visas bill, in a statement about this bill, Representative Riley Moore, who introduced this bill in the House, and he's also a co-sponsor of this bill, in a statement, he said, "Every year we allow nearly 300,000 Chinese nationals to come to the US on student visas. We've literally invited the CCP to spy on our military, steal our intellectual property, and threaten national security. It's time we turn off the spigot and immediately ban all student visas going to Chinese nationals." At the same time, the Select Committee on the CCP letter to the universities, in a statement regarding that, the chairman of that committee said, "The Chinese Communist Party has established a well-documented, systematic pipeline to embed researchers in leading U.S. institutions, providing them direct exposure to sensitive technologies with dual-use military applications. America's student visa system has become a Trojan horse for Beijing, providing unrestricted access to our top research institutions and posing a direct threat to our national security. If left unaddressed, this trend will continue to displace American talent, compromise research integrity, and fuel China's technological ambitions at our expense." So the language in these statements really reeks of this old Cold War paranoia that's linked to these long-standing tropes. That reminds me of, these fears of Asian invasion and yellow hordes invading the US. So you're a historian. Do you see any historical parallels between this kind of legislation that Republicans are trying to pass in these statements and then the McCarthyism during the Cold War? Like how alarming do you see these kinds of statements, this kind of language?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this rhetoric is clearly really, it would be ridiculous if it weren't so dangerous. And I think you're right to identify different kind of historical tropes that have been applied to Asian and specifically Chinese immigrants over the years. I think what we're really seeing is this intersection of, this yellow peril kind of narrative that was very dominant during the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act, merging with this kind of Red Scare McCarthyism of the Cold War years. And, you noted that some critics of the bill have likened it specifically to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which, I think is limited as a historical parallel in some ways, because I think it kind of misses the geopolitical crux of the situation. If we think about the context of the Chinese Exclusion Act, it's happening in, 1882 is put on the books. It lasts until 1943. This is a time period in which China under the Qing dynasty is very weak internationally. This is, on the heels of the Opium Wars. This is a context in which China is really put into a neo-colonial relationship vis-a-vis the West and vis-a-vis the United States. And I think it's precisely because of that weakness that the United States was able to use such blanket discrimination against Chinese migrants. The Chinese government was not able to kind of intervene to mediate the treatment of Chinese subjects abroad in the way that other powers were able to. For instance, Japan, on behalf of Japanese immigrants signs this gentleman's agreement with the United States, which kind of seeks to protect Japanese Americans from some of the worst and most explicit discrimination that, for instance, the Chinese face. And so, in contrast to that, I think what we're seeing today and what we saw at the height of the Cold War is discrimination against Chinese in America precisely because of China's geopolitical strength. Particularly today, with China being seen as the primary competitor of the United States, it really is this geopolitical Cold War relationship that is driving some of this rhetoric and policy towards Chinese students, Chinese immigrants. And so, to hone in a little bit more on this kind of first Cold War period of McCarthyism and how it applied to, I think, specifically Chinese students, right? Because this bill, the Stop CCP Visas Act, is specifically looking at Chinese students. And I think the figure of the Chinese student plays a really interesting role or kind of symbolic position in the way that the US has thought about its relationship to China. And so, historically, for a long time prior to the Cold War, prior to the founding of the PRC, the US really viewed Chinese students as a proxy for its own kind of soft power. So in the early 1900s, through a variety of means, the US actually offers various forms of support, subsidy, and scholarship to Chinese students to come to the United States, many of them, with elite kind of class family backgrounds, to come and study, receive American degrees, and then return to China, with the idea being that these intellectuals would go on to shape kind of the political, economic future of China in ways that would, of course, benefit the US. And so that imagination, kind of symbolic position of Chinese students really quickly shifts as soon as the PRC is founded in 1949. All of a sudden, Chinese students are not seen as, these emissaries of American democracy and liberalism. They're now seen as students who have gained access to information and expertise in the US that must be kept from the Communist Party of China. And so in 1950, kind of at the beginning of this surge of McCarthyism, Chinese students then as now play this really central role in the US efforts to demonize China and to prevent what today we might call this kind of intellectual property theft that, this bill is describing. And so basically in 1950, around 5,000 Chinese students who'd been studying in the United States essentially become stateless. The State Department basically prevents them from returning to China under the grounds that, they possess this information that could benefit an enemy of the United States. And this is a moment in which, the US and China are actively at war after China enters into the Korean War. And so I think that history, this moment in which Chinese students are, on the one hand, prevented from returning to China, on the other hand, are also being subject to FBI surveillance, interrogation, and actually threatened with deportation if they are found to have communist ideology or ties or sympathy to the Communist Party, says a lot about kind of the position that Chinese students have been put into historically, that I think we see a lot of resonance of this kind of duality even today, with this bill on the one hand representing this kind of McCarthyist Cold War image of students as proxies of the Communist Party who are here to, steal American expertise, technology, et cetera. And on the other hand, if we actually look at some of the kind of liberal critique of this bill coming from different outlets, Chinese American advocacy groups, a lot of it actually reinscribe this other historic position, this idea that Chinese students coming to the United States are going to be exposed to American democracy, exposed to American ways of thinking, and that the U.S. is really shooting itself in the foot by preventing this kind of soft power exchange from happening. And so I think both of these constructions are really kind of dehumanizing. They remove a lot of agency and subjectivity from Chinese students and instead kind of just employ them for these two different ideological agendas vis-a-vis China.
Yeah. So a few minutes ago, you talked about a little bit about how these bills in these statements, they're a response to the economic rise of China. And I also think it's really important to point out that, the Red Scare during the 1950s, those witch hunts, that era of McCarthyism was kicked off by the triumph of the CPC in 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic of China, what the U.S. now calls the so-called loss of China, as if it was ever theirs to lose, right? So after this happened, Senator Joseph McCarthy, he really went on this rampage, and he started routing out a lot of these China experts within the State Department, who he blamed for crafting policy that was too pro-China. And that started within the State Department, but it eventually spread out into other areas of government as well, and then eventually into other areas of life. A lot of Hollywood actors were victims of this Red Scare. Eventually, it kind of expanded out to target teachers, union leaders, civil rights activists, and then, Black liberation leaders as well. And so by the time that the Red Scare had concluded, thousands of people had their reputations ruined, lost their jobs, or been otherwise blacklisted. It impacted a lot of people, and a lot of people had their lives ruined. So it's not really lost on me that period of McCarthyism was triggered by the loss of China and China asserting its own national sovereignty. And this era of McCarthyism is being kicked off by, the economic rise of China and the U.S. fearing its loss of hegemony.
Yeah, I think you're very much right to identify the centrality of China to, the first wave of McCarthyism and today's kind of new Cold War. As you mentioned, I think when we talk about the height of McCarthyism during the 1950s, a lot of kind of what we might imagine is, right, it's like State Department officials, Hollywood executives, testifying before the House about their ideological leanings. But one of the I think impacts of McCarthyism that is not often centered is that it wasn't so much elites that faced the brunt of this kind of repression and ideological interrogation. It was, in many cases, working class immigrant people, particularly in Asian and Chinese American communities, because of this central role of China and because of this imagined construction of Chinese in America as potential proxies of the Communist Party of China. And so, I think it's really important that we deal with the way that McCarthyism intersected with structural racism in its treatment of Chinese Americans. And so, when we think about the experience of Chinese Americans during McCarthyism, we have a very clear kind of precedent for state repression along both racial and ideological grounds. Immediately after the founding of the PRC, the FBI begins to compile information about overseas Chinese. There's a very emblematic FBI document that is assembled in 1954 and has since been made public, called The Potentialities of Chinese Communist Intelligence Activities in the United States. You can actually look it up on archive.org. It's publicly accessible at this point, but at the time it was a very secretive internal document that was based on extensive surveillance of Chinese American communities. And it outlined, a wide range of Chinese American groups, ethnic press, newspapers, Chinese student organizations, Chinese American labor groups, and identified those which were deemed as particularly susceptible to Chinese communist influence. And many of these groups, faced not only FBI surveillance, they faced immigration raids, interrogation, really kind of the threat of state violence in ways that, in many cases, kind of destroyed the Chinese American left during this time based on intimidation and state violence. And, I think one particular example of the way that McCarthyism was specifically wielded in terms of kind of immigration control, immigration policy, is a program that's not often talked about these days. It was called the Chinese Confession Program. And it was launched in 1956 precisely because immigration authorities thought that the entrance of Chinese immigrants into the United States were essentially being compromised by the CPC. And so it launches this mass program, basically offering, on the one hand, the opportunity for Chinese Americans who had immigrated during the Chinese Exclusion Act, many of whom who had entered as paper sons. So because of these extreme restrictions on who could enter into the United States from China, basically your only way in was if you were the son of a Chinese in America who was already naturalized. And so this prompted this whole system, this paper son system of basically falsified papers that Chinese migrants would use in order to basically lay claim to entering the United States under a false identity, saying, you know, I'm so-and-so's son, and I have legal access to enter the United States. And so in the 50s, in the context of the Cold War, this becomes, from the U.S. government perspective, this massive kind of national security scare, because the government is like, we don't actually know who these people are. We don't know their real identities. We don't know their relationship to the Communist Party. And so it offers kind of this bait and switch where it offers Chinese Americans the opportunity to come forward and confess that they were paper sons or they were the children of paper sons. And the government said, you know, it's no problem. We'll allow you to naturalize, gain permanent residency. You don't have to worry about that kind of precarious status. And in the majority of cases, that's what happens. Many thousands of Chinese Americans come forward, are able to naturalize. But what the government was really interested in doing at this point is also filtering out leftists and those who were perceived or implicated in relationship to the Communist Party. And so those people who often were basically ratted out by other Chinese Americans in their community, because, you know, this is again a time where anti-communism is very internalized and there's a lot of self-policing within the Chinese American community. So many leftists were actually named by other people in their communities during their own confessions. And when the government, you know, came in to do their own kind of interrogation of these people, they said, we have evidence, you know, that you're a leftist, that you're a communist, et cetera, et cetera. And many of those people had to go through various forms of detention, interrogation, and in some cases, deportation. And so that is really a historical precedent for, one, you know, the ideological policing of Chinese in America to conform to a certain anti-communist position, and two, you know, the ways that kind of the precarious status of immigrant communities is wielded to further this kind of Cold War anti-communist agenda.
I think you're doing a really good job of connecting, you know, this phenomenon of persecution of Chinese Americans in the U.S. and foreign policy of the U.S. And I think we still have to reckon what this new Cold War and this increased aggression on, like, not only Trump, but the Biden administration before it, like what their foreign policy toward China means toward regular Asian Americans, right? No doubt these kinds of bills and these kinds of statements that are put out, they will lead to attacks on our communities. But I don't feel like a lot of people are making that link. I remember at the height of COVID, when we were seeing all these attacks on Asian American people in the US, there seemed to be a little bit of a disconnect among many people, among the general populace. But even, especially within like non-Asian people themselves, but even with Asian people, there seemed to be a disconnect between these attacks and the constant stream of anti-China propaganda that we're seeing in corporate media and US foreign policy, especially like US imperialist policy toward China. So I kind of want to get your historian's take on this. You know, during the previous Red Scare, you know, was there more of a consciousness around US imperialism and the violence that it inflicts on our communities? And what do you think has led to this shift?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And, you know, I noticed the same kind of phenomenon at the height of COVID where, you know, so much of the racist rhetoric coming from the Trump administration was specifically about China as a geopolitical entity, right? China virus. And yet, I think in a lot of kind of American liberal discourse, you're right. There was this complete separation of, we have a domestic issue of anti-Asian racism that's completely separate from kind of Cold War tensions with China, U.S. imperialism, and containment of China. And, I think there are ways in which during the Cold War, we also see this dynamic in which I think many Chinese Americans and Asian Americans more broadly are kind of encouraged and coerced towards a politics of asserting our Americanness, claiming our belonging in the United States, and in doing so, really kind of disavowing our connections to our countries of ancestry, especially when those countries are targeted as kind of enemies of the United States.
It's part of being the model minority.
Absolutely. It's part of, I think we often forget the kind of geopolitical context of the model minority. And so, I think that this promise of racial inclusion is constantly wielded to kind of discourage a kind of anti-imperialist analysis. This was very much the case in the 1950s when, as I mentioned, the kind of Chinese American establishment, longstanding family associations, civic engagement groups, very much took the line of like, we will completely disavow our connection to the PRC. In fact, like many Chinese Americans with political power in their communities had direct ties to the Nationalist Party, the KMT in Taiwan. And so they're already kind of, their interests are aligned with not Red China, but Free China, as Taiwan was known at that time. And so they had a material interest on a number of levels to kind of disavow the threat of communist China, align with the U.S. Kind of agenda vis-a-vis China, and in doing so, kind of lay claim to American citizenship, American equality within the United States. And this changes a little bit, as you alluded to. There is a rising anti-imperialist consciousness in Asian American organizing that really takes place in the late 60s and early 70s, when there's a new generation of Asian Americans. Many of them are American-born. They're, growing up and being politicized in a context in which the Black Revolutionary Movement has a particular visibility. The anti-war movement against U.S. intervention in Vietnam has a particular visibility. And many Asian Americans are going through this kind of identity crisis of thinking about, how do we relate to these political struggles that we're seeing? And, can we articulate a politics that's separate from maybe the politics that our parents, that our community leaders have taken? And so I think, we often look to kind of 1968 is the moment in which Asian American political identity is really named and invented. This is a context in which, the Third World movement globally is very strong and very visible. And Asian Americans, as well as other racial minorities in the U.S., I think, had a particular analysis around Third Worldism. There was a self-designation that people of color in the U.S. were themselves Third World nationalities, Third World peoples. And I think that kind of language and framing really pushed back against this assimilatory kind of politics that had dominated and continues to dominate a lot of Asian American rhetoric, because it explicitly made these links, right, between U.S. imperialism in Asia and the treatment of Asians in America. And, I think there's a number of historical trends that kind of account for the way in which that politics may not be as visible as it once was. I think that, the nature of U.S. imperialism in Asia to a lot of people has been naturalized to a certain extent. Asian Americans in the late 60s were watching the Vietnam War unfold. They were watching this very explicit racist rhetoric being used to dehumanize Vietnamese people. And, at that time, China was also actively engaged in supporting and arming the North Vietnamese. And so for Chinese Americans, I think there's very much this idea that, if we're part of this anti-imperialist movement, we need to learn how to relate to the PRC. And many really look to the PRC and particularly to Mao Zedong thought as a political framework to think about their own condition in the United States. And I think that, particularly when it comes to China, U.S. imperialism vis-a-vis China is not always the framework that is most obvious for people these days. I think there's a lot of desire to kind of create a false equivalence between the U.S. and China, that this new Cold War is being stoked on both sides, that these are two great powers engaged in great power competition. And I think that misses a lot of the broader geopolitical context of U.S.-China relations. It misses the way that some of the more explicit forms of U.S. militarism in Asia, if we think about the war games that just happened in Korea, if we think about U.S. troops in bases in the Philippines and in Okinawa, these are all in place fairly explicitly to contain China. And yet those connections are not always made by Asian Americans or by Chinese Americans. And so I think that, when it comes to kind of revitalizing the kind of anti-imperialism that we saw in Asian American movements in the 60s and 70s, it takes, on the one hand, a kind of rejection of the politics of assimilation and an understanding that, racism in the United States can't be separated from geopolitics. And then it takes, I think, a more serious analysis of U.S. imperialism and the way that it functions in Asia and vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, I mean, it's a shame that a lot of people don't know about that Asian American resistance to U.S. imperialism, because there's a lot of really interesting stuff there. Like, one thing that comes to mind automatically is this group called Iwokin, which was it's Cantonese and it means righteous and harmonious fists, and it was formed as a revolutionary collective in New York City, Chinatown, in 1969, right? And they did a lot of really important community work at that time. They were inspired by the Black Panthers, right? And one of their sites of political struggle was the terrible healthcare services in Chinatown. And so at that time in Chinatown, there were really no hospital facilities, TB clinics, or hospital staff that spoke Chinese. And so even though that it had the highest TB rate in the country because of poverty and overcrowded conditions, there was a lot of neglect on the part of the city toward Chinatown and Chinese residents. And so what Iwokin did was they waged a campaign of door-to-door TB testing. And this campaign led the community to join like other marginalized communities like Puerto Ricans and Black people and other working class people to fight for a new hospital which served them, and to force the city government to build a new TB X-ray and testing center. And I think it still exists. It's in New York City. It's called the Chinatown Health Clinic now. And so they also waged a campaign to get more Chinese-speaking staff at the local hospital. Mm-hmm. So, this is like a kind of history that most people don't know. And certainly I didn't know until I looked it up. So it's really a shame that this revolutionary history isn't really taught, and you have to look for it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad that you brought up Iwokin, because as you say, I think they're a really great example of the way that anti-imperialism intersected with like really local issues. The kind of healthcare advocacy that you're talking about happening in the 70s in Chinatown very much happened under this banner of like Serve the People programs, which was an explicit homage to Mao Zedong's kind of slogan to serve the people, that was very much taken up by Asian Americans and by Chinese Americans to think about kind of the material conditions in their own communities. And, I think that part of why these groups are too often forgotten from our current vantage point is, I think that intergenerational political memory is a very difficult thing to have, particularly in communities like, Chinese American, Asian American communities, where there is this constant flux of new immigration to the United States. And, I think it's worth pointing out that these kinds of Chinatown radicals in the 60s and 70s themselves were searching for political memory and history in their own communities. They were one generation removed from this context of the early 1950s that we've been talking about, when so much of the existing Chinese American Chinatown left had been silenced, deported, basically structurally dismantled at the height of McCarthyism. And so there was not a lot of visible political memory about Chinese American radicalism at that time. And so part of what the Asian American movement was really about, and part of what groups like you or Quinn and others did, was really try to forge relationships with those older members of the Chinatown left who slowly in the 70s, as new waves of activism are emerging, as U.S. China relations are starting to thaw, are kind of coming out of the woodwork and saying like, hey, we actually can talk to you about our experiences of anti-communism, of persecution, of like repression and violence in our own communities. Maybe we have something that we can share for your generation. And that kind of intergenerational conversation and sharing of lessons was very influential in groups like you or Quinn in having kind of a larger historical breadth of thinking about the history of Asian American radicalism. And, I think that's something that we could use more of today. I think that those kinds of conversations, learning about the lessons of the 60s and 70s and before, can really go a long way in, not to say that we can copy and paste kind of the political frameworks of that moment, but goes a long way in, I think, helping us to understand that we are part of this longer political lineage, and that many of the structures that people were organizing against in the 70s, particularly when it comes to U.S. geopolitics, militarism in Asia, remain pretty enduring. And so I think those parallels are important to draw.
I want to talk about a recent piece that you wrote for Time magazine. In this article, you talk a little bit about this era of people-to-people exchanges during the 70s between the U.S. and China. And the purpose of those was to sort of bridge the gap between the two nations. And I think it's really important to talk about because in this era of increasing aggression on China and McCarthyism, as we were talking about earlier, these kinds of exchanges are more important than ever for mutual understanding. And so in this article, you talk about how the Black Panthers had organized a delegation to go to China as part of an anti-imperialist tour. You mentioned that the U.S. China People's Friendship Association sent more than 5,000 Americans to China during this period. And it was all grounded in this belief that American and Chinese people from all walks of life had the power to reshape diplomatic relations. So circling back in response to the Select Committee on the CCP letter sent to the universities, China's Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning, she responded late last week, educational cooperation has not only expanded the communication channels for students and enhanced the understanding between the peoples of the two countries, but also promoted the economic prosperity and technological development of the U.S. It is in the interests of both sides. So in other words, cultural exchange, people-to-people exchange, it benefits both the U.S. and China. And in this article, you draw a parallel between these people-to-people exchanges and what has been happening with American TikTok users migrating to Xiaohongshu or Red Note, right? For the first time, Americans are exposed to Chinese people and they're able to talk to Chinese people and find out what Chinese people's lives are like without the mediation of U.S. corporate media. And I think, talking about geopolitics is really, really important to get people to understand, the U.S. foreign policy and its aggression toward China. But I don't think anything could really replace these kinds of people-to-people exchanges, these cultural exchanges. And I do think that's probably the most effective anti-propaganda tool. Meeting someone from China, even online, and realizing that you have more in common than you initially believed. And this is why the CPC, has really emphasized these kinds of people-to-people exchanges, even today, right? Because that's what threatens U.S. hegemony the most. And that's why, the U.S. has been trying to shut down a lot of these Confucius Institutes. They're almost all gone now. Nearly all of them have been shut down because they played a really important role in providing educational and cultural programming.
Right.
So, that's why I think Xiaohongshu is such a game changer, because, It's really an effective anti-US propaganda tool. And again, that's why the US was trying to find ways to ban it when this migration happened. So I'm interested in hearing your take.
Yeah, I mean, I have been really struck by the American experience of Xiaohongshu for a number of reasons. I think on the one hand, what the kind of phenomenon of these TikTok refugees on Xiaohongshu, I think, affirmed to me as an observer is the extent to which, as you're saying, Americans have been kind of systematically isolated from Chinese viewpoints, Chinese voices that aren't mediated by, corporate media or, State Department interests. And so I think I was really struck by the extent to which so many American users on Xiaohongshu just seem to be shocked that, like, Chinese people have internet humor, they have memes, they have queer culture, they have political commentary. This kind of pretty mundane interactions, mundane, just like internet culture was such a shock to so many Americans, I think precisely because they've been so insulated from these kinds of kind of day-to-day people-to-people exchanges with Chinese people. I think that it really kind of turns the trope of, during the Cold War, there was this idea that Chinese people were locked behind what was called the bamboo curtain, which is, I find, a very kind of silly Orientalist version of the Iron Curtain. But there was this idea that, we had no access to China or Chinese people because they were basically locked behind, this discursive and political prison, essentially. And I think, today that discourse hasn't changed that much. We hear so much about the Great Firewall. We hear so much about how Chinese people are supposedly insulated from a broader view of the world. And I think what these interactions on Xiaohongshu show in part is that really it's Americans who have been isolated from this global perspective.
Yeah.
In fact, the average Chinese person knows a lot more about the US culture, political system, et cetera, than vice versa. And so I think that it has cultivated a little bit of humility and a lot of curiosity on the part of Americans to learn more about China, to learn more about Chinese people on their own terms, which I think is very powerful. And part of why it, reminded me of this history of the 1970s is precisely because the nature of U.S. China relations has gotten to such an extreme point, right? We're in the height of a new Cold War. It reminded me in many ways of this political moment in the early 1970s when the relationship between the US and China is finally starting to de-escalate a little bit. And suddenly, in 1971, Nixon ends the trade embargo with China. In 1972, Nixon makes his famous trip to Beijing. All of a sudden, right, the floodgates are opened. Americans for more than 20 years had been really systematically prevented from knowing basically anything about China. And so that moment of curiosity where Americans from all walks of life were trying to visit China, were trying to learn about China, were interested in buying products and art and, clothing from China. I think there's a lot that we can learn about that kind of curiosity and that kind of excitement to forge those people-to-people relationships. Because, it really was across the ideological spectrum. You named, the Black Panthers, the U.S. China People's Friendship Association. These were kind of more explicitly leftist, in some cases, Marxist-Leninist groups that approached the PRC at this time, as, wanting to learn about socialist construction in China, wanting to see what that looks like on the ground. But it wasn't limited to the left. That kind of curiosity, that kind of exchange, and really just this baseline belief that exchange with China, getting to know Chinese people was a positive thing for that bilateral relationship and for the world. And I think that lesson really holds a lot of weight for us today because, as you mentioned, there's this context in which cultural institutions like Confucius Institutes have been shut down. Really kind of American public opinion towards China has marched in lockstep with kind of the US escalation of the Cold War. And this kind of this happens through a lot of different registers. For instance, like Chinese language learning in the United States has tanked over the past 10 years. The number of American students studying in China has collapsed. I believe it in 2023 was around 800 students studying in China, whereas I think it was in the 20s of thousands 10, 15 years ago. So, by design, Americans are becoming less and less informed and educated about China and having fewer and fewer opportunities to have these kinds of people-to-people relationships. And so that's why, I think that what has unfolded on Xiaohongshu is so important, and part of why, this history of this moment in the 70s of U.S. China friendship being mobilized as this goal across the political spectrum, that I think holds a lot of lessons for us today.
Yeah, definitely more important than ever. We need these kinds of cultural programming and people-to-people exchanges. But Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe to end, can you let people know where to find you and your work?
Sure. Well, it's been such a pleasure to be in conversation with you, Amanda. And yeah, if folks want to kind of keep up with my take on things, they can follow me. I'm on X and Blue Sky and Instagram at Tseng-Putterman. So it should be pretty easy to find. And my website is just my full name, Mark Tseng-Putterman. Has a list of some of kind of the writing that I've done over the years.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, Ne Zha Tu is now the highest grossing animated film of all time. In this clip, an artist from Suzhou brings the main character to life using coils of paper. Just a reminder, if you enjoyed this episode, please remember to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.
我这幅作品是哪吒，它是以中国传统手工艺盘纸制作而成，将纸经过细致的盘、编、剪、搓、捏、折、压、粘的手法来组合完成一幅精美的图画。